Hi, good evening and welcome. I'm Ariana Quinones with Doctors for Change. We're thrilled that you're able to join us this evening. Just a quick little bit of background for those that are not familiar with Doctors for Change. We are a membership organization of physicians, health professionals, and others that champion health for all Houstonians and Texans through research, collaboration, education, and advocacy. Our vision is a city and a state where we have all the resources we need for communities to achieve health for all. So welcome this evening. For additional information, please go ahead and go to our website, www.doctorsforchange.org, and follow us on social media. So in the interest of time, I would like to go ahead and first thank our distinguished moderator and guest this evening. This is an important topic, COVID-19 vaccinations. It's timely. So I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Katherine King, one of Doctors for Change's founding members, who's going to moderate our panel this evening. She'll introduce our speakers. Just a quick note for housekeeping, your lines are muted. We welcome your participation and questions. We know you have a lot of questions through the Q&A box. So please go ahead and submit your questions. When you have them, we'll be monitoring those and make sure that we get to as many of those as possible. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Dr. King. Welcome everybody, and let's get started.
Thank you, Ariana, and thank you all for joining us this evening. So many questions about COVID-19 and particularly about the vaccine. So we're hoping that we can answer a lot of your questions tonight. Please use the chat box on the GoToWebinar site to put your questions in. Don't be shy. Any question will be appreciated. It's my honor tonight to introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker will first talk about the vaccine and vaccine development and vaccine safety, and that is Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi. Dr. Bottazzi is Associate Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. Associate Dean, did I say that correctly? Professor of Pediatrics and co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. She's an internationally recognized vaccinologist with more than 2 decades of experience advancing product development partnerships. She is currently working on a COVID-19 vaccine that is in clinical studies. She's a global thought leader in this field and has won many, many awards internationally for her work in vaccine development and also in neglected tropical diseases. She originally obtained her bachelor's in microbiology and clinical chemistry from the National Autonomous University of Honduras, and then a doctorate in molecular biology and experimental pathology from the University of Florida. And then she did postdoctoral training in cell biology at University of Miami in Pennsylvania. So we're really lucky to have Dr. Bottazzi in our faculty at Baylor to give us the inside scoop on vaccines. And I'm going to, before Dr. Bottazzi presents her short piece, I'm also going to introduce our second speaker for this evening so you all know what to look to and prepare some questions. And our second wonderful speaker this evening is Dr. Sherri Onyiego. Dr. Oniego is part of the executive leadership team within Harris County Public Health. She's currently serves as the Director for Nutrition and Chronic Disease Prevention with Harris County Public Health. She's a board certified family physician with over 15 years of experience in clinical, in management and treatment of chronic diseases. She also does academic research and administrative experience in a number of different roles, and specifically looking at HIV, novel compounds to treat HIV. She got her doctorate in pharmacology from Meharry Medical College in Nashville, and then her MD from Ross University School of Medicine. She did residency training in family medicine at LSU, and later went on to conduct a fellowship in HIV medicine at the University of Texas at Houston. So she has a passion for public health, and we're very lucky that she now serves in Harris County Public Health. And I can see that now we have Dr. Meher Shah who's joining us. And so welcome, Dr. Shah. Would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, can you hear me, Dr. King?
Yes.
Apologies, I was coming off another call, so I apologize for joining a little bit late. But I just want to say thank you to you, first of all, for moderating this session, and I do want to join in welcoming and thanking Dr. Oniego and Dr. Bottazzi for just being, just been great partners. It's bittersweet. I think all of you may know I've been affiliated with Doctors for Change for now a couple of years. I was a card-carrying member for actually, I think it was a recognition a couple of years ago at the Health Museum, and I had said I was going to join, and I did. Unfortunately, I am going to now be giving my card-carrying membership back. Because this week on Friday is going to be my last day here at Harris County Public Health as I transition to become the next Secretary of Health for the state of Washington under Governor Jay Inslee, and I start there December 21st. And so it's an incredible honor, and in fact, it's only that kind of an honor that would take me away from this community that I love. And I've just grown to be such a part of over the last just under 25 years in Houston, and just shy of 17 years here at the department. I am leaving the department in great hands, though, with Gwen Sims, who's now been appointed the interim executive director for Harris County Public Health, and I couldn't be more proud of that designation. She's the one who welcomed me into the department many, many moons ago when I first came into the department, and just yesterday, Dr. Oniego was affirmed by Harris County Commissioners Court as the local health authority. And so that's effective December 19th. And so as I leave in my role as executive director and local health authority, Gwen Sims and Dr. Oniego are going to be taking on those two roles together. And I couldn't be more proud of both of them. They are just amazing. I've gotten a chance to work with them, and I will tell you that we will not miss a beat. We know that COVID-19 is on everybody's mind, and I really want to thank everybody for all the work that you've done throughout this past year. I've equated this to being the first half of a football game or a football match. 2020 was the first half. We're hitting halftime. 2021 is the second half. And what we do during halftime is absolutely critical to the success in the second half. But this week we've had incredible news, and I'm honored that my last week here is the first week that we see vaccines roll into our community with MD Anderson on Monday and multiple institutions yesterday, and certainly we're seeing healthcare workers be vaccinated. And I think it's absolutely critical that we have this conversation that we're having with Doctors for Change tonight. And I want to just continue to say that we're in this together. I will not be with you during this last half of the second half of the journey, but I will be cheering you on from afar. Although technically I'm going to be working remotely for several months, so guess what? I'll actually be not too far away for a bit, but don't let anybody know that. But I'm really sad to see this community not be a part of this community as I move along. So with that, I just want to say, Dr. King, thank you so much for your leadership, and I want to thank Doctors for Change. I mean, it really, I was not aware of Doctors for Change until Dr. Reed, Dr. Brian Reed, brought me into the fold, and Dr. Oniego reminded me of being in the fold. It is an incredible organization, and you all do incredible things, and I'm just honored to have been a part of that for the short period of time that I've been affiliated with Doctors for Change, and also for the period of time that I've been a part of Harris County and the Houston medical establishment. So with that, best of luck, congratulations. I'm going to miss all of you. Please come visit. Please don't be a stranger. And if I do give you a call or if I show up somewhere, please don't close the door on me, is all I ask.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shah. You know, we've just been so lucky to have you lead our Harris County Public Health for the last several years, and it's been such a great thing for our community. You've been a real champion for, particularly for the medically underserved, and that is just so important in our city. So we really celebrate everything you've done for this community, and I know that Washington State is lucky to have you.
Thank you, Dr. King. One last thing I did want to make mention before I forget. One of the recognitions this week, there have been a lot of really cool things, but one of the recognitions is actually very meaningful, and I would just wanted to point this out to your audience, which is Dean Burwinkel at the University of Texas School of Public Health. He's been a fantastic champion of public health, as you know. He is establishing a scholarship in honor. Usually it's when you're no longer around, if you know what I mean. I mean in a very negative way. I'm glad I'm still around, but for a student every year, and I'm going to be dedicating it for my father, who believed in education, and he always said that they can take everything away from you, but they cannot take away your education. And so it will be a scholarship for a student to attend the University of Texas School of Public Health as a partial scholarship for public health practice. And he is now working to get the foundational support for $25,000 to be raised in that, in the name of that scholarship. So I just wanted to make mention of that, and maybe in time, if anybody wants to contribute to that, I would just want to put that out there because it would be an incredible honor to continue to have that grow. So thank you to him, thank you to UT, and then I thank you to all of you.
That's great news. All right, thank you. Let us move on now and talk about COVID-19. So Dr. Bottazzi, we'll have you go first and tell us about the vaccine.
Absolutely. First of all, thanks so much to Doctors for Change. Congratulations to Dr. Shah. We will definitely miss you. I know Peter Hotez will definitely miss you a lot. I know you all talk all the time. Welcome, certainly, Dr. Oniego and Dr. Sims. We look forward to continue working with certainly the county, and very, very privileged to be here. And I have to tell you, Dr. King, I'm a personal fan of yours. I consider you amongst my rock star friends. So it's thank you for being the moderator of this session. So I was charged to just maybe start with a little bit of a playground and see where are we at with COVID vaccines, understanding a little bit about the clinical trials, the safety, what are we going to expect from the vaccines. Of course, I'm going to base a lot of the presentation on what we've already seen as lessons learned from the process that Pfizer arrived to its authorization, certainly Moderna that is coming behind, and what else is out there and what to expect. So I actually would like to start and already give you kind of like the punchline, because I know that we all want to hear what's really going on, right? And on the little triangle that you see on the right side, it's just a representation of how I can really simplify to you what does it really mean when we develop a vaccine, and certainly even any biologic for that matter, or even a diagnostic, a drug, even a device. And of course, for that to happen, in addition to, of course, a lot of science and basic biology, you need to, of course, learn how to produce a prototype. And by prototype is, in our case, is the little vial of vaccine. And all the intricacies that come by what we call the production and even manufacture of this so-called, prototype that eventually becomes the product used in the population. Of course, anything that you produce, you have to evaluate and test and establish not only the quality, the safety, and of course, what is it for, the value of it, as far as efficacy. But there's the green triangle, which I think is a lot of where we're going to be focusing even today, and with my partner in presentation, Dr. Oniego, that really is going to tell us, even after we do a product and we test the product, how do you even go by starting to figure out how you're going to deliver it? And all of it together, of course, the important, and especially myself and our vaccine center and many of us, especially in this pandemic, are also looking to ensuring that anything that we advance has an ability of being available to anybody that needs it. And in my case, of course, our aspiration is that these vaccines will become global, that they are, of course, distributed equitably, affordably, and that they're accessible and even reproducible, right? That anybody can then use the formula to replicate what we are doing, or what these companies are doing. But I now want to focus maybe back to the question that I think many of you may have, is this concept that it's true, we've never developed a vaccine in less than a year, or almost a year. The fastest we've been able to do such a process has been 4 to 5 years, and that's not the normality. Normally, usually it's an average of maybe 10, sometimes 20 years, and sometimes, in fact, we still cannot really develop one. Of course, it's very much dependent on what the vaccine and the pathogen we're trying to develop that vaccine for. But in this case, for COVID-19, I want to remind you of a couple of things. First of all, coronaviruses are not new. So we have many, many years that, including our group at Baylor and Texas Children's, that have been working on coronaviruses in general, even those that are not, necessarily causing outbreaks or even epidemics or pandemics. In addition, even if we look at those who already have caused epidemics or pandemics, we were at some level very, very fortunate that this SARS-2, or the one that's causing COVID, it's from a family which is very similar to the SARS family, which is the one that caused the outbreak in the early 2000s. And that similarity, it allowed us, it really leveraged us to be able to cut short, and I'm telling you, years of being able to say, okay, how are we going to even start developing a prototype for this vaccine? And on top of that, the technology that, even if you look at the year 2000, how long did it take before we actually knew the sequence of the SARS virus, which was months? It actually took less than a week when we already knew that it was indeed a coronavirus, it was a SARS-like virus, and therefore we were very, very fortunate to leverage almost 2 decades of work, and therefore already knew exactly how to target this virus. We knew that the soft spot and that what I call the Achilles tendon, right? Basically the spike protein was the one that we knew we had to target, and I'll tell you a little bit of why. Again, advances in technology. Unfortunately, also in hindsight, because we have so much virus burden circulating, that also, unfortunately, even though fortunately, also enabled that those who developed the clinical trials, blueprints and designs were able to, in fact, leverage the fact that there's so much virus circulating that they could overlap the clinical trial phases to maximize, in fact, vaccine safety and especially efficacy evaluation. And something that, in fact, doesn't normally happen is companies, when they're doing these prototypes and they're evaluating their potential safety and efficacy, they don't invest right away on large scale and manufacturing, because if it fails, of course, they don't lose, not only product, but time and money. In this case, and I think the US government has, of course, have had a lot of input in advancing funding and leveraging and supporting these companies to be able to advance the manufacturing at very large scale, so that we didn't have to wait until the studies were done before we could have the product ready. So that, together with the fact that we have also very dedicated sets of experts committees that really were ready, and even though they're also evaluating many other medicines and biologics, there were dedicated teams that would be looking very specifically at everything that comes out with regards to COVID-19, especially our regulatory bodies. So going back again to this soft spot of the virus, I think everybody knows now that, you know, the coronavirus is called corona because corona really means crown, and it's because of this appearance, of course, microscopically, of these spikes that the protein has on its surface. And in fact, this spike is really a key. It's a key that fits into a keyhole, and in this case, the keyhole is this receptor in our cells. And you know, and in fact, this receptor in our cells can be found in many cells, not only lung cells, but now we know that what is called the ACE2 receptor can be found in many cells, in many organs and tissues. And the intent of the vaccine is that we trick our bodies to think that we've already seen the spike, so that we can then make these so-called antibodies that neutralize or block the binding of, or the ability of the spike to enter the keyhole, with a lot of associated other, you know, molecules, you know, we call them cytokines, and of course other cellular, you know, activities, and that's by tricking our body to think that they're already seeing the virus, and preparing and having all the little, you know, cadets and army ready. When we actually do encounter the real virus, our body doesn't have to kind of like, okay, what is this? What do we do? They're already prepared, and they react much faster. And that's the reason why we can, of course, be immunologically protected. Now, what's the landscape? And I know we're going to focus a lot on these so-called already slated, one authorized already and one slated for authorization. So the Operation Warp Speed, amongst the different, many different ones that are being evaluated, selected a few. Doesn't mean that these would be the only ones, but for this, like Dr. Shah said, for this, you know, half-time period, we now know they have focused on this portfolio. There are two that utilizes, again, for production, an RNA-based platform, and I'll go a little bit more in depth into that. But there are other ways of making these prototype vaccines, and another one is using this viral vector type of approaches. In this case, they use a backbone of an adenovirus, which is usually a virus that we know is not pathogenic to humans. Usually they're very well characterized, and they replace a piece of the genetic code of the adenovirus, and of course they stick in the genetic code of the coronavirus, in this case the spike protein, and that's pretty much the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, that it's part of the US portfolio. And albeit neither of these two, the RNA-based and viral vector adenovirus-based vaccines, have ever been licensed before, that doesn't mean that they have not been evaluated for many other diseases before. It's just that for those diseases, it hasn't led to any licensure of a vaccine. But they're clearly, you know, platforms that they have been evaluated in many trials and for many other diseases before. The third piece of the portfolio uses this concept of a subunit protein-based vaccine, because both RNA as well as viral vector, the intent is that ultimately what is really presented to the human body is a protein. So you can either trick your body by presenting the protein already, or trick the body to have your own body produce this protein and then present it to the immune response. So this subunit protein-based vaccines, which in this case are the Sanofi GSK as well as the Novavax, these are actually our platforms for production that we have used for many vaccines. In fact, examples: hepatitis B vaccine, the human papilloma virus vaccine. So we already know, of course, they have been licensed for other pathogens, and we also have a little bit of a better ecosystem of who can produce them at very large quantities, because these are bread and butter technologies compared, of course, to the these novel technologies as RNA and viral vector vaccines. So what are these RNA vaccines? And again, I mentioned to you that it's a way of producing the actual protein, but instead of you injecting the protein in the body, what you do is you synthesize this RNA gene, of course, that encodes the spike protein or a piece of the spike protein. You package it, and usually the way that you package it, as you've heard, is probably packaging it in some lipid layers or what we call particle technologies. You then immunize it in your body. Usually because they're so small, they're nanoparticles. They're basically engulfed by your cells. And there's no way that the RNA, because we don't have the machinery to revert the RNA and make it become a DNA. So this concept that it can integrate into your genome, there's no real scientific basis for that. In fact, these are pieces of RNA that once you translate them into a protein or transcribe them into a protein, and the cells make proteins, it just disappears. So you cannot make, once the protein is made, you cannot really make any more protein. And then once the protein is expressed, then your body mounts the immune response. So it's a normal way of how, in fact, our bodies, any RNA molecule makes a protein. It's just that we're basically telling the body, we want you to make a very specific protein by giving you this very specific code. Now, what's happening around the world, right? I mean, and if you actually follow, I love following the New York Tracker, because besides the fact that I'm a big fan of Carl Zimmer, I'm a big fan of a lot of people, I have to say, but Carl Zimmer is a big fan, and certainly even Sue Lee and Jonathan Coram. And you can go in and look, but there's many others, right? And in fact, some of the ones that are selected by the US are also being considered within the landscape of the rest of the world, because some companies are also willing to, of course, contribute to the distribution and use in other regions of the world. And as you can see, the US initially has selected a few. That doesn't mean that some of these may not later can integrate inside the US landscape, but this is what's happening, certainly. And as you can see, there's even some that have received some limited use or even some limited approval in other countries, compared to, of course, what we're seeing. But in the US right now, of course, we have one that's authorized for emergency use, which is Pfizer. And most likely this week, we're going to hear that we're going to have also the Moderna vaccine. This is a slide just, again, to, from my punchline, remind you that we have not jumped any step in the process of this concept of clinical development and even in the production steps. We were just able to narrow the timeline quite a lot, I have to say, because of this very innovative ways of combining clinical trials. And that's the reason why we have accelerated the process. We're not skipping the process, we're accelerating it by doing things not sequentially, but sometimes even in parallel. And by advancing, I think one of the keys is that we really accelerated because we advanced the manufacturing instead of waiting for everything to be completed before we started producing at large scales. Now, okay, let's compare, and this may be a little bit of an older slide, but I think what it's important is a lot of the differences between Pfizer and Moderna. I think everybody today on the news was asking, what's the difference? So first of all, the way that they prepare the prototype, the formulation or the presentation is slightly different, right? So Pfizer has practically a presentation that has 5 doses per every vial. Moderna is going to use 10 doses per every vial. The amount of RNA is slightly different. The series is also slightly different. It's still 2 doses, but one is 0 and 28 Moderna and 0 and 21 is for Pfizer. There's slightly differences with the storage. We've heard repeatedly that it's true. Unfortunately, they require very onerous freezing temperatures. Moderna has a little bit of more data that allows them to understand that if when you put it in the refrigeration and even at room temperature, they can keep it a little longer. I think now they've even said Moderna can keep it at refrigeration up to a month, while Pfizer is a little bit more complicated. Even when they prepare the boxes to ship, Pfizer is preparing bigger boxes versus smaller boxes. And I think this is the reason why Pfizer was deployed initially in large medical health centers versus the Moderna most likely will be delivered to smaller pharmacies. And even though they claim they had some 20 million, 50 million availability by the end of 2020, I think we're now hearing that, it's not as easy to say, sure, we can scale it up, and we're going to have so much doses very rapidly. So I think we're going to see that, they're going to ramp up, but certainly, we may not have, so many doses by the end of this year. I think that's for sure. Certainly, they've both done some very large clinical trials. I think that, we now have seen that even though Pfizer was intending to get approval for greater than 12 years of age, we now see that they've given authorization for 16 years of age. Moderna is not even attempting. They're going from 18 years of age and above. So why this emergency use authorization? And I think we have to remember that it's very rare, of course, that we use this law of asking for an emergency use authorization. It has happened before. In fact, it has happened when we had the bioterrorism concerns using anthrax. It was, in fact, there was given emergency use authorization, and it was for very limited use, primarily in our military forces. In this case, of course, it's a pandemic. It's a much larger proportion than, of course, when we were dealing with that emergency of the bioterrorism with anthrax. But the bottom line is that it's used, of course, by the FDA to allow for something that it's still in experimental, meaning unapproved, to give it some approval, whether it's a diagnostic, a treatment like you've seen others, and certainly in this case, a prevention of serious life-threatening disease. And it's also because we know that there is nothing that is adequate or approved that could be an alternative. Usually, when they already evaluate these packages to ensure that they could confer authorized approval under this emergency use, it's most likely that there's imminent short term that the company will be able to compile the rest of the data to seek full licensure. And therefore, most likely that we're going to see that these studies were going to continue, and eventually these companies are going to request the review for a full licensure approval. So I know that probably you've heard that there's not only the FDA doing the review of the company's packages. I think it's very important to highlight that our US FDA is sometimes a little bit even stricter than other regulatory agencies. In fact, what FDA does is not only receives a package and sees what the company submits, but they independently do an independent review of the primary data. So what happens is when they then take these two packages, the sponsor package and basically the FDA package, it's given to various committees. So one of these committees is the Vaccine-Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. And then after they review and provide a recommendation, then the FDA, votes and says, yes, we're going to give authorization. And then on top of that, there's the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices that then works to establish how to do the actual allocations and delivery. And I know Dr. Oniego will tell us a lot more of how this then trickles down from federal, of course, to the states, and then, of course, to the county. So again, just to recap, there's all these committees. There's, of course, we're going to hear more about how the phased allocation was established. So I'm not going to go into that, but I just want to highlight that a lot of it in the US also, we are very fortunate that we have institutions such as our national academies, where, for example, in our case, the National Academy of Medicine was very instrumental in helping with the framework of how it would be an equitable, transparent, of course, process of allocation. Very important. Again, because there's not going to be a lot of doses available right away, we had to go through this whole exercise of where are of course, the very high risk and what are the priorities. And of course, as you'll hear more, we have this phase 1A, phase 1B, phase 1C, and how this will be rolled out. Again, just a very quick how there's going to be a quick ramp up, and then ultimately we're going to not have to worry about volume or doses available, because the companies are going to be able to really improve in production. And finally, I think, which is very important, is that even after the delivery starts, there's so many other checks and balances that we're going to be able to continue building on the safety data. In this case, of course, we have the vaccine adverse reporting system. They've added even a vSafe, which is with this app that you're going to be able to participate as an active, person that receives the vaccine. There's, of course, all these communication strategies through the clinical immunization safety assessment. So there's so many things that I think is going to even continue building on the safety and efficacy. That's true, however, we have some knowns, which of course we know that vaccines are effective. We know now that they're effective at preventing disease, that we know that it can even boost potential individuals that are previously exposed, but studies are not by means complete. We have to now start waiting to see how long is the durability of such vaccine immunity. As you know, we still don't have studies in children, in this case now 16 years of age and younger. We probably are going to expand in studies for other target populations, for example, women, pregnant women. And we also do not really know, how effective will these vaccines are reducing the transmission and the spread. And I think here is very important to ensure that even though you may get vaccinated and you have less risk of having severe disease, it's not likely going to prevent you to get infected 100%, and you therefore are going to be transmitting the virus. And that's why we are advocating for continued use of masks and, of course, distancing and other safety measures. So I want to stop and hand it over to the next speaker. Certainly make sure that we still believe in the science and the process, and certainly we have to be patient too until maybe a few of us receive the vaccine. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bottazzi. That was excellent overview. And I know there are already some questions for you, but we will hold on to those until we have heard from our second speaker. So thank you so much again for volunteering your time to share with us your expertise. All right, so for those of you who may have joined us a little bit late, our second speaker is Dr. Sherri Onyiego. She is a director at Harris County Public Health and can really tell us more about vaccine distribution plans and questions from a public health standpoint. So thank you, Dr. Onyiego.
Well, thank you, Dr. King, for moderating. Thank you to Doctors for Change for having this really important discussion, and certainly want to thank Dr. Bottazzi. I am a huge fan of hers, and so I just certainly want to thank her for lending her voice and her expertise to this very important topic as well. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and I don't know if you can see my slides. Are you able to see them?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. All righty. So one thing to note is that this information contained in the presentation is accurate the time that the presentation was created. Some of the slides obviously were, we've been doing some of this work for several months, and some information has been updated. And as throughout the entire COVID-19 response, it's rapidly changing and information is rapidly evolving. So just know that in terms of the some of the information is accurate as of the current time of this presentation. Just a little bit about what we'll talk about in the presentation. Just a little bit of an overview of Harris County Public Health. I'll certainly talk about the distribution phases, the priority populations, and for certainly don't want to overlap some of the information that Dr. Bottazzi says, but I'll just quickly go through a little bit of some of the information that we do know about these platforms of the vaccines. But specifically, I will spend some time talking about the clinical considerations for Pfizer. As we know, as Dr. Shaw mentioned earlier in the call, we are certainly at a halftime point, and certainly happy to see that the vaccines have arrived. And certainly we'll end with the conversation on the important topic of vaccine hesitancy, vaccine confidence, and I'll also leave you with some resources that will may be insightful for you in your practices. So you heard from Dr. Shaw. We are certainly happy about his transition in the next chapter for him. He's been a key and instrumental leader for our organization, and with Gwen Sims in her role, the leadership is certainly strong, and we know that the work that our workforce in the public health realm has been doing throughout this response has been valuable to our community. Our county is big, it's diverse, it's complex. As you know, it's the third most populous county, equivalent to the size of Rhode Island, with nearly 5 million people spread over 1,700 square miles. And our response has been multi-faceted. Really, we were monitoring the global impact of COVID-19 very early on. And then certainly when it reached our region in March, we were already prepared and had responded. We sent out our very first health alert to our community on January 9th. So we have already exceeded our 11-month mark in terms of our response as an agency. So almost a year-long response that we have been in activation mode. We have been really focused on mitigating the spread of COVID-19 in our community, and we are moving forward now in this phase, as Dr. Shaw illustrated earlier with this halftime metaphor. We do know that as it relates to this particular discussion tonight with the evolving landscape of COVID-19 vaccines, we already know that there's going to be there is limited supply as the production ramps up, and we also know that there are certainly considerations to keep in mind, not just related to the storage, but also as it relates to the scheduling of these vaccines. So a number of people have asked, what is our role in the COVID-19 vaccination process? And what I can say is that it is a multi-layered or multi-step process, really with state and the federal government leading that process and having a local involvement at the foundation of that process. And so, as Dr. Bottazzi has already very eloquently illustrated a lot of the processes that go underway with the EUA process, as well as with the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, their role in this is very critical. And I don't want to certainly duplicate some of that information, but I'll just say that Texas receives allotments directly from the federal government. The vaccines, especially the ones that we have now, Pfizer, we can just talk about Pfizer, it ships directly to those individuals or those vaccine providers who have signed up to be vaccine providers. The Department of State Health Services has a online web portal that allows vaccine providers to directly sign up to be vaccine providers. And as I mentioned, one of the things that happens once that process occurs is that the vaccine, once it's ready, it will ship directly out to the to the vaccine provider. And so that's different from typical situations that we've been in terms of an emergency response. It's really been, we've gone directly through the state. The state has done the allocation and the distribution, but with this particular vaccine process, it's coming directly from the manufacturer. And then it ultimately goes to the local jurisdictions. Our role specifically as a health department is multi-layered as well. So we have we've really been very targeted throughout the response in terms of our outreach, education, and awareness, and that's no different when it comes to the COVID vaccine. We've also been very instrumental in ensuring that we have a dedicated vaccine team or COVID planning team that's really recruiting vaccine providers. And they've been doing that by overlaying specific data points throughout multiple different ways. And so one of the things that we can certainly do is engage with the state and look at where those vaccine providers are, identify where the gaps are within our county, and be able to engage with those local vaccine providers, as well as recruit additional providers where we see gaps. We'll continue that process along the way, but that's been one of the key roles that we have been playing very early on in this process. We'll also be able to provide technical assistance and support to our community health providers, our FQHCs. We're on a call with them today, and certainly we'll be able to provide ongoing technical assistance. And we will also be very integral in looking at that population level in terms of the denominator, the number of vaccines that are actually allocated and actually sent out to our communities. And lastly, we certainly know that there will be, as we see more and more vaccine rolled out and distributed into our community, we do know that there will be populations that may have limited access to care. They may not have a primary care home, or they may not have an opportunity to have easy access. And so we will serve as a safety net in the future as additional vaccine allotments come to our community. So this is just the really more of a few slides here that really talk about the phased approach to vaccinations. And so, as I mentioned, the Department of State Health Services has a web-based portal, and vaccine providers have to go through that specific portal in order to register to become vaccine providers to receive the vaccine. In addition to them signing up on that web-based portal, the Department of State Health Services will review their request. They will ensure that they have the ability to store those vaccines appropriately. As you already heard from Dr. Bottazzi, a number of those vaccines have to have certain specific storage to ensure that they're handled properly and stored properly. So vaccine providers must be able to prove that they're able to do that. And the other thing that vaccine providers also have to do is have access to be able to register those vaccinations into MTRAC. And they are mandated to have any vaccine that gets disseminated or distributed to an individual. They have to document that within the MTRAC system within 24 hours. And so we have been very active in this portion of the process with ensuring that we are informing vaccine providers of those specific regulations that they have to have and that they have to meet in order to become vaccine providers. And in phase one, which we're in right now, we've already talked about the fact that Pfizer has received its EUA, and we are in a phase where there's limited supply of the COVID vaccine that's available. We also know that this initial rollout with Pfizer will be primarily focused on healthcare workers and residents and staff of long-term care facilities. One other thing to point out is that there is also a expert vaccine advisory panel at the state level, and we do have some local participation that's present on that expert panel, and they will be the voice for our state as well as our community in determining what those additional priority populations look like. As we move to phase two, where we're in the early part of 2021 into the summer, we do anticipate that there will be an increased number of vaccine doses that will be available. We know that Texas also has plans to send out or deploy specialized vaccine teams to really identify those critical populations that I spoke about. In phase 3 and phase 4, that's really the summer to October or the latter part of 2021 and beyond, where we'll have an ample, sufficient supply of vaccine for the entire population moving forward. And we do know that there will be a booster preparations that will be needed for these or 2-dose series. And so we will likely be able to also identify where those gaps are and where the additional uptake and coverage will be needed once we're in these specific phases. So it's a timeline that really takes us to now until the end of next year, where we're looking at really seeing the larger population vaccinated. We do know that there are critical populations that have been identified with healthcare personnel being a priority for the COVID-19 vaccine, and that's primarily because healthcare personnel are on the front line. We know that there's a high risk of exposure and also the ability to potentially transmit it to others who may be at high risk. One thing that we know is very important is that healthcare personnel can positively influence the decisions that others may take or have to come to when it comes to them getting vaccinated. And so we know that healthcare workers can positively influence the decisions of peers, patients, as well as other community members. And this just really illustrates a little bit more in detail about the first phase. We have tier 1 and tier 2. I'm only pointing this out because I think you already know that with the last couple of days, we've seen the hospital staffs at our community hospitals receive the vaccine, and we're certainly excited about that. The second tier, really, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that it does involve more of the community-based or outpatient-based population. Specifically those individuals that may be coming in contact with symptomatic patients. And one thing I want you all to know that from a public health standpoint, we've made note of the fact that this specific recommendation calls for symptomatic patients, but we do know that up to 40% or even more of individuals with COVID-19 may be asymptomatic. And so we certainly would like to make sure that other populations who are serving patients or the community who may be asymptomatic are also accounted for when it comes to this prioritization. That would even include other healthcare providers such as dentists or even ENT specialists, as we think about people who may be doing aerosol generating procedures. And so certainly wanted to just put a pin in that and just bring that to you all's attention. But these are just the more detailed sort of subpopulations in that phase 1, tier 1, tier 2 group. As Dr. Bottazzi has already mentioned about the processes that are involved with fast tracking, I certainly don't want to duplicate that information. She's done a wonderful job of explaining it. The only thing I'll just say is that it's really important to know that there weren't any corners that were cut when it comes to the processes that went into the safety and the approval process with these vaccines. The FDA and the CDC are certainly continuing to review the information, even as this vaccine, as the Pfizer vaccine is already out. And so they're certainly maintaining that all of those standards and measures are completely done and not taken lightly. We do know that the safety is a top priority. Again, those same safety standards must be highlighted, and I think that it can't be said enough that these processes have been done carefully. And we, even after the vaccine authorization has been met, that the vaccine safety and side effects will continue to be reviewed. As Dr. Bottazzi pointed out, there's the vaccine tools that providers can report to, as well as the VSafe platform as well. This just illustrates a little bit in more detail some of the information that she's already covered. Really just talking about the development, manufacturing, regulatory review and approval process, and really how that standard vaccine time looks versus what we're dealing with when there's an emerging pandemic such as COVID-19. So I'll just talk a little bit more about the fact that the the vaccine platforms right now, the Johnson & Johnson preparation is really the only one right now that is in a one dose preparation from the information that we have, at least from the ones that are at the advanced phases of clinical trials. In terms of the FDA emergency use authorization, I'll just go through this one. Really, I'll just skip through this one since we've already talked about this one in previous presentation with Dr. Bottazzi. This is just a little bit more information, and this is also a bit of an older slide, but I just wanted to at least talk a little bit about the racial and ethnic breakdown of the participants with the Pfizer and the Moderna. And so with Pfizer, over 40,000 individuals were enrolled. It was 150 clinical sites with about international and domestic, with 39 of those being in the US. And so 13% of those individuals who participated in the trial were Hispanic, 10% African American, 6% Asian, 1% Native American, with 45% in the ages of 56 to 80 years of age. With Moderna, 30,000 were enrolled at 89 clinical sites, 32 within the US. And so the racial and ethnic breakdown of those participants were 20% Hispanic, 10% African American, 4% Asian, and 3% were others, with 64% of those individuals being 45 and older. We've also already talked about the cold chain preparation, and this just illustrates a little bit more about the direct shipment points of the vaccine. As I was mentioning earlier, the difference with this response is that this vaccine is not necessarily coming directly from our Department of State Health Services. It's coming directly from Pfizer to our local hospitals and our local jurisdictions for distribution and dissemination. The Pfizer vaccine specifically, as Dr. Bottazzi mentioned, it's already coming in preset size allotments. What they're calling with the Pfizer vaccine is coming in almost like what they call a pizza box. And so it's 975 vials in that preparation. And these shipping containers already have very technical and high-tech GPS tracking and temperature monitor gauging that comes with it to ensure that the vaccine is shipped and stored adequately. So I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the clinical considerations with this vaccine, with Pfizer specifically. CDC had a recent COCA call that really was, that outlined quite a number of clinical considerations that we know that our healthcare workers will be certainly interested in having. So I'll just walk you through some of the information. As Dr. Bottazzi has already mentioned, the Pfizer vaccine has been approved for individuals 16 and older. There is a 4-day grace period allowing the second dose to be administered. So essentially, it can be administered as soon as 17 days after the first dose. Now, if the 21-day time period is extended, or is for some reason the 21-day mark is missed, the second dose should be administered as soon as possible. Otherwise, that 95% efficacy sort of range that we have, it can be compromised. One of the other things that's really important to note is that other vaccines, such as influenza or Tdap, they really should not be administered within 14 days of receiving the Pfizer vaccine. This vaccine has also been noted to be safe and efficacious in individuals who've had previous COVID-19 infection, and no additional testing is indicated for those individuals. One thing to note is that for individuals who are currently have acute COVID-19, It is recommended that they wait for those acute symptoms to resolve, and that the isolation period that they are undergoing, for that to be completed. One other thing to also note is that for individuals who have been exposed to COVID-19, but have not developed COVID-19, but they're exposed, and so meaning that they're in quarantine, it's also recommended that they finish their quarantine period first before getting the vaccine, and that's simply to ensure that symptoms of COVID don't develop, and that if they go out and get a vaccine, that it does not put the healthcare workers or anyone else in a position to potentially for them to transmit the vaccine. There are noted local and systemic symptoms that have been noted with this vaccine. It should not restrict the second dose. Antipyretics have been recommended to be used ahead of that second dose. And as mentioned by Dr. Bottazzi, it's not 100% effective. We do know that there is, it's important for both doses to be obtained in order to have that 95% efficacy. And because it's not 100%, we still have to keep those infection control or prevention measures, or those public health prevention measures that we continue to talk about, in place because of that. There are comorbid conditions that individuals may have, and they're in general not impediments to the vaccine unless there's a clear contraindication. And so there are also some special populations that I just wanted to also touch on, specifically those individuals who may be living with HIV or other immunosuppressed conditions. They can receive the vaccine as well. The safety profile of this vaccine is not fully elucidated yet, but the risk-benefit ratio of someone developing severe COVID-19 disease certainly needs to be taken into consideration, and it certainly is far greater than the risk of the vaccine. Pregnancy is a similar situation that we've talked about with the HIV and with immunocompromised patients. The recommendation is that pregnant women consider receiving the vaccine after they've made an informed decision with their healthcare team, with their healthcare provider, really also taking into considerations of what the community transmission rate is, the level of community spread. Again, there's no safety data in pregnancy. Those studies are currently underway. One of the things that has been recommended is that, again, carefully weigh the risk and the benefit, but certainly the risk of developing severe COVID-19 disease, especially in a pregnant population, is a risk that certainly needs to be weighed compared to a low theoretical risk of a vaccine. Similarly, in terms of lactation, it's a low risk to the lactating mom since it's not a live vaccine, and we would still recommend offering the vaccine as well for mothers who are breastfeeding. And so I also wanted to just make sure that we talked a little bit about the allergy update and the components of the vaccine. There were reports that you may have heard about with 2 individuals who were healthcare workers in the UK who developed severe reactions after receiving the Pfizer vaccine. I will note that these were individuals who already had a history of severe reactions to previous vaccinations. And really to be cautious and to have a measured approach, individuals who have had a history of severe reactions or anaphylaxis to prior vaccinations or injectable therapies or medications, we are considering that they should defer the vaccine until more information is available. Now, this is not the case for individuals who may have an allergy to topical medications or non-medications such as food allergies, pet allergies, latex allergies. It's not a contraindication, and we would recommend that individuals get vaccinated. And CDC has put out recommendations for time periods for observing individuals, and that's available on one of their resource tools, which I've included in this presentation as well. There are no preservatives in the vaccine that have been linked to develop an allergic response. There may potentially be a possibility for individuals to develop an allergic response to the nanoparticles that Dr. Bottazzi mentioned, or to some of the stabilizers or adjuvants. The most common one would likely potentially be the polyethylene glycol, because it has been linked to allergic responses in the past. And I want to just kind of end the latter part of this presentation just talking a little bit about vaccine confidence and vaccine hesitancy. We do know that recent surveys have been done. One survey has noted that more than 50% of the general public said that they would receive a vaccine, but we do know that the vaccine will be accepted more if a healthcare team says it. If the general public hears it from a healthcare team or healthcare provider or someone that they truly trust. We also know that vaccine acceptance increases when individuals know that there's no cost associated. If individuals know that it'll help them to get back to work safely, help them get back to school safely, that they can get it very easily, and that they have trust in the process by which it was manufactured and developed. We also know that there's hesitancy amongst healthcare providers. One survey that was done in October by the American Nursing Foundation survey showed that more than 60% of healthcare workers were somewhat or more confident that the vaccine would be effective. A third of them said that they would voluntarily receive the vaccine, and more than half were comfortable discussing the vaccine with their patients. The CDC did a web survey in October, really targeting healthcare providers, and more than 60% said that they would also get a vaccine. But I just really wanted to just point this out to just illustrate that we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to vaccine hesitancy and vaccine confidence. And I think that having discussions in forums like this tonight is so important in really trying to garner and really build that confidence. And so when we talk about what confidence is, it really is the trust that has to be built brick by brick, one patient at a time, one family member at a time, one parent at a time, and one provider at a time, one colleague at a time. And they have to have trust that they have to have trust in the vaccines that we're recommending. They have to have trust in the providers who are administering those vaccines, and they also have to have trust in the processes and the policies that went into developing those. And then I just want to leave you with a few words on communications, specifically communicating with patients about the vaccine. And we've already talked about these phased rollout, and so we're looking at, likely 2021 into that time frame, the mid-2021 summer time frame, where we will be having a much more rampant or adequate supply for the general population. But prior to that, patients will have a lot of questions, and so it's really important that we have effective ways to communicate with them. And certainly one of those is to get vaccinated yourself. Start having those conversations early, despite what that phase rollout looks like. Engage in those conversations with them and be prepared for questions, because they will likely have many of them. From a public health perspective, we're already, we've constantly been updating our website, putting out materials, really addressing a lot of those questions, and really debunking a lot of the myths that are out there. And so just know that there are going to be questions, and to just be prepared for those questions that your patients may have. And really come at it from a place of empathy and understanding. Patients may want to get vaccinated, but they just still may have questions. And I think it's really important for them to hear from healthcare providers that will give them strong recommendations. And as I mentioned, it's really important to take those opportunities and take those conversation points as key opportunities to really address the misinformation, debunk a lot of those myths that are out there about the vaccine, because you are a trusted ally that so many people rely on, and certainly hearing your voice about the true and accurate facts of the vaccine is so critical and important and us really having adequate uptake of the vaccine in our community. But until then, it's really important for us to really continue those preventative measures that we have continued to talk about from a public health standpoint, the 3 Ws. We talk about washing your hands, washing distance, and wearing masks. And certainly the disinfection protocols are certainly really important, with especially sanitizing and disinfecting high-touch areas. I've also included a number of resources. Our website is also chock full of resources. It's hcphtx.org. The CDC has a number of resources, especially as it relates to the Pfizer's rollout. They have a number of vaccine trainings, webinars, clinical trackers, FAQs, posters, training modules on a variety of topics. I've also included the link for Pfizer's review memorandum. And then as Dr. Bottazzi also mentioned, the VSafe health checker, that link is also included. And that's certainly a way to have individuals go into a mobile-based platform and be able to put in any symptoms that they may have experienced after receiving the vaccine. And I'll leave you with this quote, that vaccines don't save lives, but vaccinated people actually save lives. And I certainly want to thank our vaccine planning team at Harris County Public Health, and also want to just finally leave you with one of the things that I mentioned very early on January 9th, we sent out our first health alert, and we send those health alerts out on a regular basis, and we send those out to the region, targeting healthcare professionals specifically. We update them on a myriad of topics as it relates to COVID-19 or any other public health threat in our community. So I've included the link here as well for individuals who may want to sign up for those health alerts, or if you have a proxy that may want to receive those alerts. And I will end there and stop my presentation, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oniego. That was fantastic. Okay, so we have the privilege of having our 2 speakers here to answer questions, and we've gotten a number of great questions on the chat. So I'll start by asking you a couple of questions, Dr. Bottazzi, just to combine a couple of the questions. I think you mentioned that none of the adenoviral vectors or adenovirus-based vaccines have been previously approved. And so one of our questions is, what was the barrier to those prior vaccines?
Well, it's hard to tell what the barriers are, except that, of course, when you use that as your backbone and you're trying to see if you could use them for a specific disease, against a specific disease, it's very dependent, of course, of what you're trying to tackle, right? Whether you're using them, for example, to make an adenovirus vaccine to combat HIV. As you know, that it's the nature of the virus that also makes it quite difficult. There's another aspect to it that maybe one of the reasons is we use adenoviruses that, of course, we are exposed all the time. And I think there's, of course, adenoviruses that are human, like, for example, the J&J uses an adenovirus 26, which is a human adenovirus, but the AstraZeneca uses a chimpanzee adenovirus. And there is indeed the likelihood that because we're already exposed to the adenovirus, and that's most of what's being presented, and only there's a little piece, right, that when it becomes into proteins, what the body sees, it sees a lot of a big virus, and then the little sequence that we really want the vaccine to be against. The body gets they already know that it's something that they've already seen before, and they preferentially try to respond towards the adenovirus and not the actual piece of the gene that you're trying to insert. So that's why, for example, sometimes you don't see as efficacious responses, maybe even long-term memory responses. So that's, I think, that some of the reasons why most likely there hasn't been an adenovirus that has already been used as a platform to express some other vaccine.
Okay, great. And next question for you as well. When will we know how long the vaccine lasts and whether or not we're going to all need to get revaccinated, for example, on an annual basis?
Oh, that's tricky, right? Because if you want to establish long-term, how long is long-term memory, you have to have time pass, right? So that's the challenge, right? After somebody gets vaccinated, you have to evaluate how good the person responds or a group of people respond, and then how long it lasts. So time has to go by. Sometimes you can infer. For example, a lot of it we're trying to infer of how long the natural immunity lasts in people. We always think that vaccines are better than natural immunity, right? Because you're very targeted. So the hope is, of course, vaccines will be are triggering a better response, a more targeted response, and therefore a longer response. But that's really the million-dollar question, right? But there's really nothing wrong to say, okay, we got 2 doses, you see a good response, you certainly are protected against severe disease, but later, maybe months, years, you get a booster, right? I mean, we do this all the time with other vaccines, right? In fact, very rarely you have vaccines that only use a single dose, right? Hepatitis B uses 3, the Shingrix uses 2. So I think it may not be uncommon that we may want to have a reinforcement in a later time frame.
Great. Okay, excellent. One of our audience is asking, how do we know that the vaccine was 95% effective?
Well, I'm not a statistician for sure, right? But there's a lot of statistics in it, and that's why when you design these trials, you have to also be very clear of what we call the primary endpoint of what you're really looking for, right? So in this case, the design of the trials were very specific to say there's a number of people who gets a vaccine and a number of people who doesn't, right? Who gets the placebo. Then we let the people go live their daily lives. And in fact, because we have so much virus, it didn't take too long of a time to start seeing people getting infected by the virus. And then in this case, they were really looking at how many people that, of course, were in the placebo group versus the vaccinated group had symptoms, and you categorize those symptoms, and then you do all those statistical calculations, which honestly I am totally unsure how they do it, but that's where they came from with having the different calculations of 95, and that's why it's important to also look at longer term, right? See how many more people have the same effect to maintain that statistic. And that's why when they designed these blueprints, they had a minimum number of what I'm going to call clinical events that needed to happen before they could establish that statistical significance.
Exactly. And actually, the New England Journal paper describing the Pfizer vaccine just came out yesterday, and I had the chance to look at it. So, they waited until they had 170 cases of COVID-19 symptomatic illness. And then they looked at those 170 and unblinded themselves. And out of those 170 people who got sick, 162 of them were in the placebo arm, and 8 of them only were in the vaccine arm. So that's, you simply divide 8 by 170, or 162 by 170, and you get 95%. So it's that's the way. But I do want to make a point here, which kind of relates to something that Dr. Oniego said, which is, why do we need to wear masks after we've had the vaccine? And this relates actually to the vaccine trial, because the primary endpoint of the trial is symptomatic disease. So we know that the vaccine prevents symptomatic illness, but we don't know whether the vaccine prevents asymptomatic carriage of the virus. So I think it's really important for us to remind our patients and remind ourselves that even when we've had the vaccine, we still need to wear the mask until we have more information about whether that vaccine is actually preventing us from having asymptomatic transmission as well. Great, thank you. So many people, Dr. Oniego, have questions about when can they practically expect for a regular person to be able to, get in line for a vaccine, and how, actually what's the process? Are they going to be notified by their primary care physician? How does that look?
Yeah, and so like I was saying with our current phase, because what we're looking at right now is this phase 1, and so the expert vaccine advisory panel for our state is meeting on an ongoing basis. Actually, they're meeting on, I think, tomorrow. They will be going through the second priority group, so that 1B group. And so as they continue to have those recommendations, whether that's going to be law enforcement, the critical populations or vulnerable patients in the high risk group, those delineations will be forthcoming in those recommendations that expert vaccine panel sets forth. It does look like, at least according to the broader scale phase rollout for the general population, it looks like that's probably going to be more into the 2021, like the summer sort of time frame, where we'll have more sufficient supply as production ramps up, that we'll be able to look at the larger general population. We'll also be able to have a better sense of having our finger on the pulse where some of those gaps are, and then where we need to sort of deploy specific efforts to either increase communication, increase engagement, and then also target specific communities for vaccinations. And those may be communities that may not have healthcare access, but as we see more and more vaccine platforms that don't require special storage, special handling, then those are going to be vaccines that may likely be carried in their, typical pharmacies or physicians' offices, and so will be more widely available as more presentations become approved and available.
And is the expectation that every provider will be using MTRAC as the sort of database, the shared database where all this information will be kept regarding each person's vaccination status and which vaccine they're getting?
Yeah, so at least the information that has been explained to us, especially from our state partners, is that MTRAC will be the required database tracking tool that providers will have to enter that information in.
And that's right now just Texas, right? So if we have people moving between states, that's not going to cover those people.
Now that I don't know. I can follow up on that particular aspect. I do know that from Texas standpoint, that MTRAC is the required tool.
Okay, great. And another great question is, does somebody need to be negative for COVID-19 prior to getting the vaccine? And I could interpret that question two ways. Do you need to be PCR negative, but do you also need to be antibody negative?
Well, we know that the way that it's been indicated doesn't preclude that if you've already had the disease or even been infected, you are eligible. What I believe they're not allowing is, of course, if you have an active infection and disease at the time. So you cannot have the virus actively to get the vaccine. Like you probably wouldn't get a flu vaccine if you had a cold, right? So I think it's similar.
Yeah, actually, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Actually, I thought that was very useful data that Pfizer provided, which was that about 1,000 people of the 44,000 that were enrolled had evidence of prior infection, and the vaccine was efficacious even for that subgroup of people. So it's, in a sense, that's evidence that people may be able to get COVID-19 twice, and that the vaccine is important for people, even people who've had COVID-19 already.
And going back to that question of maybe even a little bit durability or how good the vaccines, is that in fact most likely they were a booster, right? You know, that it added on to whatever natural immunity these individuals may have had. Now with the vaccine, they probably, you know, are now reinforced.
Right. Okay. So how the general public wants to know, how do you get in line to get a vaccine?
So I think one of the things to just point out right now is because we are in a situation where it's a limited supply. It is a phased prioritization process right now. And then as more and more distribution becomes available and those prioritizations are set, especially with the expertise that's available with the EVAP panel, we will have more information on how the general population will be able to access that. But I do think that the anticipation is that as more and more supply becomes available, as more and more products become approved and authorized, that your local practices, that retail pharmacies, places like that, will be able to have the capacity to be able to provide those vaccines and be able to inform our community of those of that resource to be able to get those vaccines.
Great. Okay, another question from the audience. For somebody who's had a very severe autoimmune response to a prior influenza vaccine, for example, is that a contraindication to getting an mRNA-based COVID vaccine?
Well, I'm not a physician, but I know that my question would be, I think you probably need to reach out to your physician and really evaluate. I don't believe right now there are any major contraindications. Certainly if a person is immune suppressed or if he has an immunological syndrome, it's very different, that consideration if you have an autoimmune. So I think the best strategy is that you do this in consultation with the who's taking care of you.
Great. So a question about herd immunity. What is the percentage of the general population that needs to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity? Or really to think about practically reopening businesses, schools, and other aspects of public life?
So we, in fact, our group at Baylor, we usually do modeling evaluation. So we've actually worked with a group from City University of New York with Dr. Bruce Lee, even though he's not the Bruce Lee of the karate. It's Dr. Bruce Lee. He's an MD economist. And we recently published that, fortunately, we now know that with a vaccine that has certainly 95% efficacy for severe disease, that's already a good step. Ideally, you also want to have a vaccine that is quite effective at interrupting the transmission of the virus on top of it. So higher efficacy, better it is, but that has to also be paired with probably no lower than 70% of the population to really start seeing what we call the reduction of these viral curves that everybody's been listening to from the start of this pandemic, that we really have to reduce the curve. And until we don't balance that, depending on how much efficacy and a lot of coverage of the vaccine, we won't be able to really start seeing that herd immunity and therefore really seeing that the disappearance of such virus. So I don't think it's going to be that easy, because as you can hear from the fact that we are ramping up on the basis also of availability and many other vaccines coming in, it's probably going to take us probably the entire 2021 to at least start seeing more and more usage, right? And also remember, it's not just in Houston, it has to be entire Texas, entire the US, and then outside of our borders, because if we want to start traveling and freely as we used to be before in 2019, we need to also ensure that outside of our, of course, country, that you also have the same coverages, right? So it's going to take probably, maybe a year, a couple of years before we really see that.
All right. So it's just about 8 o'clock. So I wanted to be respectful of our speakers' time. I think I'd just like to end by saying, of course, millions of people are getting vaccinated just in the next couple of weeks. And there is ongoing data that's coming in from the trials, the Pfizer trials, the Moderna trial, and we're just continuing to gather more and more information as time moves forward. So yes, there will be more updated efficacy data, more updated safety data, and data that's going to help people who have specific conditions and situations. So lots of reason to hope for a better future. So thank you, Dr. Onyiego. Thank you, Dr. Bottazzi. We really appreciate your expertise and sharing your time with us today. And thank you to all of our audience for joining in. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.